everyone, and welcome to the second day of the ISF Virtual Congress 2021. And today we'll start the day right away with a very interesting and a very important panel discussion. Panel session number 2, which is titled The International Seed Trade and COVID-19 Key Learnings for the Future. My name is Marcel Bruins and I will be a moderator for today. Like many other sectors, the global seed sector had an unprecedented year with the onset of the COVID-19 pandemic. But the seed sector did not come to a grinding halt. In fact, quite the opposite. Seed companies around the world remained very active in producing, breeding, and trading quality seeds. And in an effort to get a detailed picture of the impact of COVID-19, the OECD, in cooperation with the Japan Ministry of Agriculture and with the assistance from the International Seed Federation and the Asia and Pacific Seed Association, APSA, they carried out an analysis of such impact on the seed supply chain, specifically on the Asian continent. And this roundtable aims to provide a better understanding of the global seed production chain and to spark a discussion on what the current challenges are and what policy responses can be carried out to safeguard the seed supply chain. But before we dive into our panel discussion, we will start off today with a keynote presentation by none other than Mr. Csaba Gaspar, and he is Program Manager of the OECD Seed Schemes. Csaba, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Marcel, and good morning, everybody. First of all, I would like to thank to ISF to give us the opportunity to present our recent study on the effect of COVID-19 pandemic on the seed sector, the global seed sector, and specifically on the Asian seed supply chain. As Marcel mentioned, this study was initiated by the Ministry of Agriculture, Forestry and Fisheries of Japan because they had some concerns at the beginning of the COVID crisis that they will not have enough seed for the next sowing season. As you may know, Japan is relying on seed import, especially on vegetable seed, and that was even more serious concern for them. Because they did not have enough information what will happen in the next few months or during the COVID crisis. So that was the reason why Japan contacted the OECD Secretariat to provide them some help and information, collect information, how the seed market is standing and how resilient it is during the COVID crisis. To be able to do this work, we contacted the International Seed Federation and, of course, the Asia Pacific Seed Association because they had already some studies and information as well on the private sector. And we wanted to contact especially the seed companies in the region to have first-hand information what's going on in the seed market. The OECD itself undertook some surveys also amongst government of the member countries of the OECD seed schemes, and we wanted to combine these two information which we received from the government side and from the private sector to elaborate this study. One more thing that the APSA worked with the World Vegetable Center during their work. So they also provided useful information to this study. If we go to the next slide, please. So, I already mentioned some of the background concern, but at the very beginning, that was the concern that if we have enough the disruption, they did not have sufficient, first of all, they did not have sufficient information on the seed market, what's going on, because the information is scattered between private sector and the government, so nobody really knew what's going on in the seed market, even though the seed sector is one of the best regulated sector in agriculture. The other concern was how long the COVID-19 pandemic will last. And as we see even today, even though in some areas of the world the things are improving, the pandemic is, we have a better situation, but many parts of the world are still suffering from COVID-19. So we are still not over of this crisis. The other concern was that many countries, and most countries, they declared the agricultural sector as essential. So it allowed the production of agricultural products, including seed, in most of the countries. But as we saw from the study, some Asian countries still suffered from restrictions and movement of people, and also transport of seed. So that was also a concern, how we can manage this situation. And of course, all the governments, they undertook different measures to stop the COVID-19 virus and the spreading of the virus with lockdowns, social distancing measures, reducing mobility, and a lack of transportation because the air traffic and land traffic was restricted. So all of those issues affected the seed trade. If I can go to the next slide. I would like to just briefly mention the key outcome of our survey on the Asian market, and also some global consequences and relevance of that study. Of course, the study is quite a lengthy paper, so I would not like to go into all of the details, but I just want to send the key message that what we experienced during this study, that the seed demand was decreased in Asia, and that had various reasons, probably because the tourism was down, so restaurants, they did not order enough vegetables, for example, so producers, they saw that and they produced less, so demand was less for seed as well. And it was different logistical problems. But also, on the other hand, some companies experienced increase of seed for the consumers. So persons who stayed home started to grow vegetables more and more often. So that was they had better market for the small packages of vegetable seed. But altogether in Asia, the conclusion was that the demand decreased, and the companies, they concerned about that. The other concern was problem was the availability of staff for seed production chain, but also it was a problem that in the government sector, it was also a problem. It was not enough staff because the social distancing and lockdowns. So it affected the production in many countries. The other outcome was of the study that the distribution of the seed from the seed production site to the farmers was disrupted, and that was mostly thanks to the travel restrictions, transport, availability of transport, air transport or land transport. Both of them, they were problems, and also crossing borders was also an issue. All in all, we concluded that the Asia-Pacific region was more affected by the COVID-19 than generally the other parts of the world, because seed companies who had the headquarters in the Asia-Pacific region, they suffered more than seed companies who had the headquarters outside of the region. But the good news is that despite all of the challenges, the global seed supply chain was reasonably resilient during the crisis, and that was underlined by the International Seed Federation as well. according to their information received from the seed companies all over the world. Can we go to the next slide, please? Of course, OECD is our main job is to provide policy advices to our governments, and this study is not different. So we, based on the outcome of the surveys, we provided some policy advices to our member countries, but it will be also available to everyone once the study will be declassified and disseminated. First of all, before going to the detailed policy recommendations, I would like to tell some considerations which the government had to take into account or should take into account when they change policies. First of all, seed, as you know very well, as this is a seed sector meeting, is a key input for the agricultural supply chain, and it play a key role in food security to provide sufficient and nutritious food for the population. So this makes the seed sector very important for all of the governments. Access to high quality seed is also very important because it helps to increase the livelihood of farmers and the resilience of the sector in general, including the farmers or other actors in the seed or the food supply chain. The other important fact which has to be considered that most of the countries, they cannot supply farmer with high quality seed of their choice from their own production. So international seed trade is necessary, and international seed supply chain has to be or should be maintained to be able to give the right choice of seed to the farmers and the agricultural sector. Economically, of course, is a lot of benefits of an internationally interconnected supply chain, and the seed supply chain is very similar to that. So if a country wants a resilient seed sector, the national seed sector should be connected to the international seed supply chain. This is an issue because during the COVID crisis, some governments or policymakers started to think about to nationalize the seed production. Of course, it was understandable because everybody was afraid that there will be no seed available on the market. But what we see at OECD that the risk of nationalizing a system, economic risk, is higher than having an international interconnected system and mitigate the negative effects of that international interconnected system, such as, for example, disruption in transportation or other similar issues. The last one, that governments, they missed up-to-date information during the crisis, even though I said that the seed sector is a well-regulated sector in agriculture, but because of the specificity of the sector, many of this information on stocks and ongoing production is held by the private sector and some parts held by the government. So it's very difficult to collect all of this information together as of today. So this is, I think the policy makers, they need to consider this specificity of the sector when they start to develop new policies to make the seed sector more resilient. So if we can go to my next slide, please. So we can go to the policy recommendations, and I would like to just mention the main recommendations. The first recommendation would be to ensure production and movement of seed during the crisis. Of course, this is quite an obvious recommendation, but as we experienced during the study in Asia, that was not obvious. Some countries that the movement of seed was not maintained as it should be. So we recommend all of the countries to classify the seed sector and agriculture sector as essential, which would help to continue the production of seed and the movement of seed in the country, and also the international trade of seed. The other important issue which has to be considered that during a crisis, making sudden changes to the regulatory framework of the seed trade can affect negatively the trade and the availability of seed, because the government officials are under the pressure during a crisis. They have a lot of work, so it's difficult to adopt new requirements. But it can be said on the other side of the seed sector and seed companies, they need to follow different regulations, and if changed during the crisis, it would be difficult to fulfill all of the changed requirements. So we suggest to avoid dramatic changes to the regulatory framework. The last part of this recommendation would be to increase communication and coordination between the national authorities, because we saw in the crisis that there were sudden different actions from the government to mitigate the effects of the pandemic, but it was not harmonized at the beginning of the crisis, so it affected the trade. And we saw in our seed scheme, when the government started to communicate, they found solutions which was acceptable for all. So that facilitated to help to maintain the seed production and trade, and also the availability of seed for farmers. If we go to my next slides, please. So as I said, the internationally interconnected seed supply chain has a lot of economical benefits, which overweight the risks, and it's better to mitigate this risk than nationalizing the seed production and try to supply farmers with seed from local production. The seed companies, especially the big international seed companies, they follow this practice for a long time now, that they have seed production sites around the world in different spots, which can help to mitigate climatic problems or any kind of issues with seed production. So if one side is down, the seed can be produced in the other side. So the seed supply is more stable and safer and more resilient in this way. So we suggest for the governments to help at this international and diverse seed production. And there are different ways to do that. The first of all, as OECD is also part of the international regulatory framework for the international seed trade with other international organizations such as ISTA, UPOV, but also we can mention ISF from the private sector side. So it is recommended to support active participation in these international organizations, because this is how we can harmonize the policies and standards in the different countries, which would help to reduce technical barriers to trade. The other important issue is to help developing countries to be able to access to the international seed trade as a producing country. So that would help the developing country to increase or develop their national seed sector. They can learn new technologies, and they will have more money if they produce seed for other countries. But also they could sell their seed for other countries as a next step. So that would be useful from both sides for the stability of the international seed supply chain, but also for the national food security issues. And also, I mean, as OECD is doing that, we can provide capacity building for these companies to help them to adopt international standards, such as the OECD seed certification standards. If we can go to my next slide, which would be to support digitalization of the seed supply chain. The COVID-19 crisis highlighted the importance of the digitalization of the different regulatory frameworks, such as OECD seed scheme, but IPPC, ISTA, and UPOV also have digital systems. We found it that in our OECD survey, that those countries who digitalized their national certification system, they were more resilient, they had less problem to maintain seed production than those countries who did not do that. So we would suggest to start developing digital systems, especially international digital systems, which could help to mitigate problems of development between development levels of different countries, because some countries may have money to digitalize their systems, some countries they don't. But if we have an international digital network or system, that would be easier and cheaper for the countries to join that international digital network. As I mentioned, in the OECD, we just started our digitalization project, and we have high hope for that, which could increase it would reduce the cost of the certification cost in one hand, but it would also have to increase the transparency of the seed market, and also it would be a good tool to combat fraud when the system will be set up. My next slide, please. And as I mentioned at the beginning of my presentation, it is important that the decision makers, they have the right data, because this is the way how they can do evidence-based decisions. So it's very important that the government officials and policymakers, they have that information on their hand when they create new policies. At the moment, this information is missing from the seed sector. Particularly, as I mentioned before, the information is scattered, held by private sector and government sector, so it's difficult to put together the information. There are some examples in the agricultural sector for such information system, which is one is the AMIS, which was developed by the G20 to forecast any food crisis, and actually this is an international database of available stocks of different food products. As OECD is also working and part of this AMIS, the system, we had discussion in the House if similar system would work in the seed sector, but we found that because of the specificities of the seed sector, such information system would be not really useful. So we cannot joining AMIS, which would be the easiest way of doing this. And most problem, which I think is that the seed cannot be replaced by another seed because it's a different variety, it's adapted for different conditions, or some varieties are not approved by some countries, thinking about the GMO varieties. So that would be very difficult to replace. So even if we have a stock of corn seeds somewhere, this does not mean that it would be available and useful for the country who want to buy that seed. So at the moment we are missing this international network or database, but as I mentioned, we are working on a digitalization of our seed scheme, and one part of that digital system would be an international seed certification hub, where we would like to collect information on the ongoing seed production, which could be a good indicator to policymakers how the seed availability change during the time. But this is the future, and we are working on that, and we will see if this system could be a basis of an international information system on seed availability worldwide, or at least in OECD seed scheme member countries. Marcel, that was my presentation, and thank you very much for your attention. And I would give the floor back to Marcel.
Thank you so much, Shaba. That was very interesting and also very important. I think it is crucial that we have such sets of recommendations for governments so that they can further work on improving the resilience of their seed sector. So what I heard you say was two important recommendations. One, that there should be more intergovernmental digitalization initiatives to bridge that digital divide. And the second big recommendation that I heard you say is that there is a need for more international coordination on real-time data sharing, and that of course can lead to early warning systems. Is that a good capture?
Thank you, Marcel. Yes. On the first one, on digitalization, as I mentioned, many of the international organizations are working on digital projects, but actually at the end, it would be the main goal would be to develop one or an interconnected digital system between these international organizations. As you have the eFITO, the ISTA certificate, the digital OECD level, and it would be all interconnected. That would be the final solution. And actually, the international organizations have this goal. As you may know, Marcel, that we have the World Seed Partnership, and all of these organizations are members of that initiative. So we are harmonizing our digital initiatives as much as possible. So we will see, this is the future, but I think this is what is a good direction, and we should not miss this opportunity. On the early warning system, I think this would be also important, but we have a lot of challenges here because of the availability of information. But at the end, I think it would be useful if we would have a certain level of information sharing, harmonization of information sharing systems. So that would be a great development. But that's also the future.
Thank you, Shaba. That is very interesting. And of course, it's clear that the COVID-19 pandemic meant a lot of hardship for a lot of people. But it is also very important that we try and learn from it. For example, through the study that the OECD has recently carried out. Next up, we will hear from our four panelists. We have 4 experts for you, either here in the studio or joining us remotely. And from Paris, we have joining us online Ms. Leanne Jackson, and she is the head of the Agro-Food Trade and Markets Division at the OECD. Hello, Leanne.
Hi, Marcel. Nice to see you.
And from Bangkok, joining us, we have Ms. May Chochui, and she's the Executive Director at the Asia and Pacific Seed Association, APSA. Hello, May.
Hi, Sawadika. Hi, Marcel and everyone.
From India, we have joining us Mr. Arthur Santosh Atavar, and he is Chairman and Managing Director of the company Indo-American Hybrid Seeds. Welcome, Arthur.
Yeah, thanks, Marcel. Thanks.
And here with me in the studio is Mr. Szabos Rutner, and he is Regulatory Affairs Manager at the ISF.
Good morning, Marcel.
We will now soon open the live Q&A with all participating delegates to the Congress. So if you have any questions for our expert panelists, please make sure you're typing your questions into the Q&A function on your screen, and I will be receiving those questions here on my iPad as they come in. So let's start off straight away with our first question, and I'd like to start from a broad perspective, a global perspective. Xabi, what would you say has been the impact of the pandemic from that global perspective?
Thank you very much, Marcel. Indeed, we heard a lot of good coverage from Csaba's presentation. So if I would like to highlight a few, first of all, we try to gather information from our members, from our national seed associations. So we made several surveys throughout the pandemic, and we give very good feedback from all over the world. We haven't really go down to the individual companies' detail. We wanted to have indeed a more comprehensive overview what's happening in the seed trade globally. And indeed, in different regions were differences. So there were regions, especially those regions where you have like a legislative framework, a common legislative framework, they coped a lot better and easier in this pandemic situation, while others have more problem. I think if I have to pick a few examples which were basically present everywhere, is the problem of the movement of labor, because as we know, seed industry is a very labor-intensive sector. The other one is to access to transport, and also the price of the transport, which has been increased, and also some administration problems, especially at the seed certification, variety registration, seed export-import permits, which slowed down. And this was, I think, we felt everywhere. So no matter which region we got answer, there was a common thing. On the other hand, what we also experienced, and it was also Csaba alluded to, that companies reacted very fast to these challenges. So they implemented measures in-house to protect their workers, but still maintain a good level of operation. So I think this was very positive experience for us. From the government side, also almost all governments, we got feedback, they declared agriculture, including seeds, an essential business, as a critical business. So some form of flow of seeds could be provided even in the most precious time. So I think the bottom line is that no farmer left without a seed, and this is, I think, what our sector is biggest aim. So I think we absolutely fulfilled our primary goal and primary objective to provide the farmers with sufficient good quality seed. We experienced, of course, problems. But if you see an overall picture, and this again, it's an overall picture, so some region probably suffer most, what we see that the impact on the business itself, in the end, it hasn't been negative. So companies are still coping really well and didn't change too much in their major operations.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Xabi. Now that we've heard the global perspective, I would like to turn to you. Csaba, in his presentation, he spoke about the impact of the pandemic on the seed sector in Asia. Could you share a bit about the impact of the pandemic in your region?
Yeah, thank you very much, Marcel, for this question. I just would like to elaborate more on the Csaba's presentation, and also similar to what Xabi has shared from the global impact, right? So APSA and World Vegetable Center, we work together since May 2020. Well, actually, we started from April 2020 to study this impact when the government start to impose the lockdown policy and travel restriction in most countries in Asia Pacific region. So at that time, we could reach out to around 132 companies, and most of the companies who have responded, they are from medium and small size companies. And that time, when we collected the data, we found that 60% of responders reported that seed demand and their capability to work on research and development, as well as the production trials, had dropped. And that, of course, due to travel restriction and labor shortage. And so the highest negative impact was found in the international seed shipment due to the high freight cost. And I think that this is similar to what Shaba or ISF has found the same. And I believe that not only Asia Pacific, but of course other regions got the same effect or impact on that. And besides that, we observe a slow lead time of getting the custom clearance and acquiring import permits. And so besides that, APSA also has done more study on the seed trade volume that we will publish in our magazine issue 2. So we found that actually the volume of seed trade in 2020 in Asia Pacific region, we see slight drop also in the volume of seed export. We found a drop around 10% comparing to the 4-year annual average. And the decline also was even found as double or 20% less than the baseline that we compare from the previous 4 years for import volume in Asia Pacific region. So basically, I do believe that that creates an impact also in the volume that we can see also in the data. Thanks, Marcel.
Thank you, May. I heard you say 60% of the companies, of the responding companies, reporting a negative effect. That's quite high. But of course, that was 2020. And I know that you also did a more recent assessment of the impact of COVID in 2021. Can you share a little bit about what happened there?
Definitely, Marcel. So recently we worked with our working group of integrated vegetable seed companies and our standing, special interest group of field crops companies. So in total, there are around 34 companies which actually they have, like a high impact, I would say, or very good reputation in terms of vegetable seeds production and field crops production in the region. So we found the report, of course, in terms of the perspective that the company thinks on the international seed movement, that we show is found better trend in the sense of the perspective that they used to score as a strongly negative impact. So we see the international seed movement showing 20% as a strong negative impact, but still overall we see this is still highlights as the main impact. And we found the same, concerns also on the labor shortage, also the freight cost still high, though overall factors we see, is progressing in a positive side.
Mm-mm. Thank you, May. Indeed, a slow recovery can be seen from the impact of last year. Okay, so we heard a little bit about the global perspective, about the Asian perspective. I'd like to zoom in a little bit on the company perspective. Arthur, can you share a little bit what have been the changes in the approaches, or what kind of adaptations have seed companies made, seed companies such as yours, what have you made towards making that seed available on time to your customers?
Yeah, thank you, Marcel. In fact, it was quite challenging when we started out because it was just around the season, beginning of the season in 2020 when the pandemic struck and there was the lockdown and there's so much uncertainty. But one of the first things that happened in India, and luckily for our company and the seed industry, was that seeds was also classified and mentioned separately as part of essentials. in the past, it will always get clubbed into agriculture. So this was a great help to us. And in addition to that, we had to adapt because, as mentioned, the transportation was a real challenge for us, and our costs started going up. But at the same time, we were trying to look for different ways to transport seed because we have field crops as well as vegetable seeds, and we had to get the seed to the customer. So we quickly adapted and found different ways. We transported by train, we transported by trucks, and every way possible. And it really helped us to adjust to that situation. But having said that, it was quite challenging because every state had different rules because agriculture is a state subject. So we had to deal with a little bit of getting permissions for the transportation of the seeds. But having said that, we were able to get the material there on time. So it was a real learning to adapt to a different way of operating. One of the major learnings we had was from our headquarters, we were not able to really move out into the upcountry areas where we do the packing and dispatch. So a lot of, the handling was left to the flow managers and the dispatch managers. And they really...
Audio of Arthur. I hope we can quickly solve this small technical issue. And perhaps while we are looking into that, I would like to switch to Leanne. Leanne, we indeed saw already in Shaba's presentation that many countries were able to ensure an almost unhindered seed trade thanks to a number of policies. Leanne, can you share a bit what type of policies in the overarching, in the whole agri-food supply chain did countries implement in 2020 and also 2021?
Thanks, Marcel. Yeah, I'm sort of zooming back up a bit to talk about the policy perspective from the OECD.
I'm
because
afraid
we
also
had some...
here we are experiencing...
I hear it.
Okay.
It's okay?
No, go ahead, Leanne. It's okay.
Okay, thanks. So we have at the OECD quite an extensive amount of effort going into monitoring policies. And of course, during the COVID experience, we upped our monitoring so that we could try to be looking in real time at what was going on. We have an annual monitoring report that is published each year. We published the 2021 version on June 22nd, and it covers all the observed policy interventions that we saw last year during COVID, as well as other non-COVID related policies. So what we observed is that there were almost 800 unique policy measures that were implemented by countries around the world, and about 500 of those were implemented in the first 4 months of 2020, and many of those in the beginning of 2020 were indeed related to trying to relieve unexpected bottlenecks. So there was this declaration that all ag products and, in many cases, ag inputs were declared essential, which allowed those products to move across borders more seamlessly. There were efforts to invest in digital tools to make sure, again, that border crossings could happen, even with the health restrictions that might have made it tricky. There were interventions around labor, which is particularly important, of course, as everyone knows, in the agricultural sector. So there were some efforts to make sure that unemployed workers who were maybe more based in urban settings could actually be used to move into agricultural production. So we saw a really wide variety of measures implemented. About 37% of those were directed specifically to support. So this is financial support to the sector, including some kinds of grants to help companies bridge the gap once the pandemic shock hit. And about 2/3 of them were temporary. So they were really sort of crisis management policies. When we look at the numbers, we saw that $157 billion were earmarked for support to agriculture and food during the COVID times. So if I can talk maybe just quickly about a few lessons that I think come out of our monitoring that could be, that are relevant to the seed sector. The first is the importance of avoiding trade disruption. The second is keeping an eye on the periphery. If you're a company that's working along ag or food supply chain, paying attention to some of the peripheral issues, for example, around logistics and labor. And the third is investing in communication, coordination, and transparency. So if I can pick up on the trade bit first, we also have a product that we produce every year that's called the Annual Outlook. We produce it with the Food and Agricultural Organization, and this report this year shows that how important trade is for food security. So we know that about 20% of all calories consumed have crossed a border. And I'm sure everyone in this meeting is aware that, of course, seeds also cross borders many times. So it's really critical to keep the agricultural sector free of distortions. And included in that, I would add thinking about regulations, and in a sense, when there's a big shock like COVID coming in, the incentive for many governments is to do something quickly, and that might mean to take an intervention that's unexpected, that's then going to hit the private sector in ways that requires them to adjust in order to have access to that market. So, so what's important about this lesson is that keeping trade moving was really critical in terms of the resilience of the supply chains, and that, of course, is also relevant for seeds. The second was this issue of keeping an eye on the periphery. So we've had consultations with the private sector, and they talk a lot now about how the shipping sector, for example, is still having bottlenecks related to the very dramatic decrease in demand at the beginning of the pandemic, and then this bounce back in demand from parts of the world as the pandemic progressed. And the shipping sector is still trying to get the ships to where they need to go, and there are holdups at ports, which then cascade all the way through. So for us, advising governments, but also providing advice about policies, it's really important not just to look at the supply chain in terms of a one-dimensional supply chain, but also to think about the other pieces of the supply chain that affect how that supply chain moves. And then the last point I wanted to make is this importance of investing in transparency. And Chaba already gave the example of the AMIS platform, which brings together international organizations and also countries. And what's interesting with that example is that this was set up more than a decade ago. And so there were habits of communicating, habits of sharing information, habits of coordinating across countries, including with other policymakers. And those habits were the things that were used in the moment of crisis. So the people were used to communicating, they were used to working together effectively. And I think it's really important not to lose sight of the fact that while we all say that transparency is good, we actually have to invest in the mechanisms before we really need it. And that's one of the big lessons, I think, from the COVID experience for resilience in the food sector generally, but also in the seed sector. Thanks.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Leanne. That was very interesting. I also see, looking at the time, it is very close to noon in Paris time. And I'm afraid, I was told you have a very important meeting at the OECD that you couldn't escape from. So you will have to leave us now. Very sorry to see you go. Good luck with your meeting.
Thank you
but
so
of
much.
course, we have a good replacement for you, and that is Mr. Chaba Gaspar. Welcome back, Chaba.
Exactly. Chaba will stand in. Thanks so much.
Then we have resolved our small technical issue, and I want to circle back to Arthur, because Arthur, you were sharing what adaptations that seed companies have made to deal with the COVID pandemic.
Yeah, I was talking about how we had to empower downstream. The managers were on the, 300-400 kilometers away to make quick decisions. But luckily for us, we had, the WhatsApp and the phones that were very helpful to call each other. And then finally, we started also using a lot of the virtual platform more than we ever did before. And we started moving to the new normal, which according to me will probably stay. A lot of it is going to stay back as a change, and it'll never go back to the old. So this sort of adaptation we did initially really helped us to move on with the business. And that was a real learning for us because we hardly had a month's time to adapt and then prepare the dispatches and send it across. And there was all this pandemic all around and a lot of uncertainty everywhere. But thanks for the essentials, being included in essentials, we were able to mobilize that. Yeah, that's
Okay, thanks, Arthur. I'm going to stay with you a little bit longer, because we've talked about digitalization now a few times. It fell in the presentation of Shaba. Arthur, can you indicate a little bit how a good digital platform has helped the seed industry during the pandemic?
Yeah, the digital platform in terms of, since our movements were actually restricted completely, we had to move on to the digital platforms that were available. And in fact, we had a lot of our review meetings on that. And at a later stage, we even started using the video parts to even visit some of the research plots, and a lot of our R&D managers and staff, they started even exchanging information based on the visuals from the field. So that we hadn't done before, because always people would travel and that would take care of that. So that was a major shift, a paradigm shift actually from what we were used to earlier. And when the whole organization can't really travel and you have to rely on the digital platform, I think it's been a real boon to us. And a lot of it, once again, might stay as part of our routine matters. And that'll also help us to cut certain unnecessary expenses. We've also realized that there's a lot we can do even without traveling.
Okay, thank you, Arthur. But of course, it's not just the digital efforts in the seed companies that have been undergoing changes. And Shabi, perhaps you can share a little bit what the current status is and the level of digitalization in the different regulatory areas, and then specifically those regulatory areas that govern the international seed trade.
Sure. And also picking up what Santosh said, I think companies today, they are using amazing tools for the breeding, for the seed production, remote sensing, and basically all their quality management, quality supply chain are digitalized. So individual seeds could be traced back to the original source. So I think it was timely that really the regulators are picking up the pace and started to initiate some new good initiatives. And if you put this into the perspective of the breeding from seed production, variety registration, seed marketing certification, so we see that basically, as it was said, the whole spectrum is highly regulated. Many segments of it are regulated by international standards or measures in one kind. So there's a plenty of opportunity to have some internationally standardized, digitalized platform. And especially if we are seeing from the variety protection, seed production, and seed marketing. So if you go to variety protection, we have the UPOV convention, and as we know, there's a PRISMA system which allows applicants, seed companies to file a PVP application in multiple countries with one application. So it's absolutely streamlined the variety protection system. Similarly, I think it was mentioned, it's already established, if you see the seed certification and marketing side, there is a e-phyto system which enables the exchange of phytosanitary certificate electronically. And also at OECD level, and there is this new initiative to digitalize the OECD seed schemes, to have a digital hub which help to communicate in the country certification system where they already established their system. So it's again building on something existing, but put it on a more global platform. And also ISTA with their orange certificates, there are pilot programs and feasibility studies to make it happen. So I think it's the right age, and I think, like with everything, COVID really accelerated the need and all the progress that could be made in this domain. So we are really looking forward to be engaged and remain engaged. And as I think Csaba said, to provide that those systems were linked somehow, because those systems could leverage from each other. So if you have a variety tag and you scan the tag in a barcode scanner, and you can have all the information on the varieties, the variety description, whether it's PVP protected, I think it's enormously gives a kind of security to the seed trade. So for fraud and counterfeit seeds, it will be more difficult, because you have a real-time system to check all those information. And also from this traceability aspects, to provide statistics for the government will make this flow much more easier than today. So there are many aspects which we are just discovering, and we are very glad to see that these organizations, these international organizations, are really partnering with the seed industry to build these kind of systems.
Okay, that's very great to hear. Thanks, Xabi. And we have a question coming in from the audience. This is a question to you, Xabi, and it's a question from Philippe Lezigne from Bayer. Xabi, what are the key areas that our international seed sector organizations will focus on, even more so than before, to address the challenges faced?
You mean the pandemic phase?
Absolutely, yeah.
I think it's the level of cooperation. The level of cooperation, what we need to build our regulators. I think this showed us that we are in a global system, so we cannot really focusing on areas which are just addressing specific national problems, because and this is not just because of the pandemic. We have the other challenges, which is really showing the need for further diversification. Further diversification our seed supply chain to really mitigate the risk. This can be any type of risk. So it could be weather risk, it can be political program, economical crisis. I think the seed and the breeding, you cannot afford not to supply farmers with seed in individual years. So this is what breeders are doing today, and have to do it more so in the future, to try to diversify their breeding programs, their seed supply, seed production, and also the trade. I think this is the best advice could be given to these problems we are facing today.
Absolutely, very good advice. Thanks, Xabi. But of course, apart from all these wonderful plans and roads ahead, adoption of these plans and really implementing all the digital efforts is another thing. And Csaba, I would like to check in with you a little bit. Can you share what we have seen in terms of adoption of the various digital tools in the agro-food supply chain in 2020 and 2021?
Thank you, Marcel. I'm not sure if I understood your question correctly. So you wanted to hear some information about AIMS, or what would be your...
Okay, great. Thank you, Csaba. But I've also picked up on the fact that there are quite different levels in the implementation of digitalization between countries on the one side and between companies on the other side. We're seeing countries where the digitalization efforts are very far advanced, and on the other side we are also seeing countries and companies where that is not yet the case. Arthur, I'm going to check in with you. Can you share a little bit what efforts have been made to bridge the digital divide, and how companies perhaps could increase the access to the internet?
Yeah, I feel the digital divide the gap has to be closed across the, markets, across the villages, because this is the age of information. And the access to information and access to the digital platform has gone beyond just companies and individuals and businesses. It has to permeate downstream right to the level of the farmers, because today a lot of activity is happening digitally, and as a result the access to this, it's almost like a right for everyone to have it. But of course there are challenges in rolling out the connectivity issues are there. But my suggestion, at least from the Indian perspective, would be that we have a lot of great companies that are really working on establishing more and more access to the digital platform and internet access. So those companies will have to have an inclusive approach and consider that the field of agriculture, and specifically the seed industry, must be included in that approach, so that everybody connected with this field can also have access. And in addition to that, everyone other than the seed industry, anyway, they're going to have the access. But what I'm trying to say here is that the internet access is going to become more and more critical as we move. And it's also going to increase the speed of business, because the decision-making processes and the information flow can be speeded up. And thereby it will also ultimately impact the ease of doing business. This is the way I look at it. Thank you.
Thank you, Arthur. But we realize, of course, that all these efforts also cost a lot of money. And Shaba, I want to come back to you. In your view, Shaba, what types of investments have contributed to resilient food systems?
Thank you, Marcel. So in our view, it's very important. This is for us, the digitalization is the high priority at the moment, but not only the seed sector, but in general in the agricultural sector, because consumers also want to see how the food was produced at the end. So all of the food sector is working on that, and this is a high investment there. Digitalization I think, is one of the most priority here. And what is important, that if the seed sector can join to the digitalization of the international food sector, that would be also a great advantage for us, because then it would be really farm to fork digital traceability could be established if we are integrating ourselves to that system. So I think that would be the most important investment at the moment, what we learned from the COVID-19 pandemic.
Thanks, Shaba. I'm hearing a lot of changes, a lot of efforts, both on the side of countries and on the side of companies, but all these changes cannot have been easy. Arthur, from a seed company perspective, can you share a bit how things like inventory management or forecasting among seed companies have been impacted by the pandemic?
Yeah, Marcel, I feel it's really impacted inventory management in ways beyond which we had imagined earlier. Back in the 70s and 80s, many companies would always carry excess inventory of fast-moving products so that they would never run out of it and the customers would be able to get it. And moreover, just producing it, a good product, going to the field over and over for production was always a challenge. So we would do it and store it. But then we got into the 90s, and after the 2000, and the inventory carrying was just enough, just in time, and that was a different approach. But today, when you have the uncertainty back on the radar, I feel carrying inventory, like in our company, some of the products we've decided that we're going to go for a 24-month availability, because we don't know, if there's another lockdown, or if the uncertainty factor is so high that we might have to take a risk. So we've decided, yes, okay, wherever we have sure short products, we carry a lot of inventory. But that is domestic. Now, coming to the international production, for example, if we are doing some production overseas in some of the Southern Hemisphere countries, then that we feel that it's even higher risk because of international movement of material, where we might need to again carry more inventory. But the only challenge that many seed industry colleagues will understand is that when you're carrying inventory, you have to be really sure about the product, and that it's worthwhile carrying inventory of certain SKUs, so that, and from that angle, your forecasting has to be very accurate. You'll have to go with enough data and maybe a little bit of gut feeling, so that, you've made the right decision. Because the data, the qualitative data is another challenge during these times. But we're hoping now with the vaccinations and all, things will start changing for the positive. But definitely, as of now, probably another 12 months to 24 months, we would carry more inventory than we traditionally have in the last 5 years.
Thanks, Arthur. Several efforts and different practices have been tried and tested. And I'd like to go back to May. May, seeing all these efforts, I'm sure we have been able to learn from those various different initiatives that have been tried. From your point of view, May, would you be able to recommend any best practices to the companies to cope with the situation?
Well, actually, this is also the same question that we have collected from our seed company members, and they have shared so many good practices, and similar to what Mr. Santosh Atua has mentioned. So I can help to share, in each area that they have shared the best practices. Perhaps some companies can adopt that also. So of course, they put very good protocol on the sanitation for the employee who need to work at the site. So they provide very good, PPE, and also very good checkpoint. And they also put a better policy for work from home, and some companies also, they support like internet package for the employees. So moving for the aspects of the marketing plan, the planning for the marketing campaign, they of course start to use the digital platform to demonstrate the feel or the performance of the new variety to introduce to the market. And more of that, they also provide very good application or the tools to connect with the farmers, so that they can help to give the agronomic practices to the farmers. And similar to what Mr. Santosh mentioned about inventory management, so I would not again repeat on that point, but of course they plan better on the next season planting, especially the movement of the parental lines. So these are all the recommendations that we have gathered from our members, and I do believe that this is very useful also for the seed companies right now, that they are still coping with the pandemic. Thanks, Marcel.
Thanks, May. Those are some very important recommendations, and good luck with the implementation at the national level. But of course, we also heard earlier in Shaba's presentation that all these efforts and all the methods and rules changes to cope with the pandemic were, of course, a bit easier in developed countries. And Arthur, I want to come back with you about developing countries. How can developing countries work on improving the local seed production and their supply systems?
Yeah, that's a good question. There was earlier mention about nationalizing the seeds industry or part of it, and going back to that aspect. The first thing, smaller entrepreneur companies and startup companies and youngsters, they need to understand the fundamentals really well if they want to develop local supply chain systems and have a better understanding of the, the agroclimatic zones that are required to produce good seed. One of the challenges sometimes is you would like to produce a temperate crop in a region where it's not possible. And that's where this is connected in a way. The policy is important for that. But coming back to that, I think today with the information available everywhere and so many, institutions are making so much of information available to young entrepreneurs and those establishing supply systems, that it's a lot easier than it was in the past. I think even several organizations like the OECD and several others are coming forward with a lot of information that they are sharing so that people can benefit, and new supply chain production can be taken up in many countries across the world. And I believe that's the need of the hour, where you're going to become self-sufficient. And to become self-sufficient in seeds, you'll have to first establish a proper supply chain, for which you need the science to go with it, and you need the temperament to develop it. But it's possible, and today there are more tools available. And once again, integrating the digital part and most of the access to information that's available over there, I feel out there, on the internet and on several other platforms, it is necessary, and it can be possible over a period of time to do this capacity building in startup firms and startup companies and individuals who want to take it to the next level in terms of supply chain.
Yeah, thanks, Arthur. And the questions keep coming in from the live Q&A. And to our audience, if you have any questions to our panelists, please make sure you type those questions into the Q&A function, and I will be receiving those in front of me. We've heard quite a bit about the global seed supply chain, and I want to circle back to Shabi. Shabi, the global seed supply chain, do we really need it?
Yeah, this is a good question, Marcel. I think we are challenged as a seed industry. We are challenged as an international organization that what is the right response, why we are doing it. And we are often criticized that it's purely a profitable issue. We are producing seeds in country because there is cheap labor, and this issue is much more complex to that. So I think the assumption or the baseline, what Csaba already said in their conclusion, that today there is no country who can supply their farmers from their own production. So seed companies are breeding, trialing, producing seeds all over the world to mitigate a certain risk. So there are many elements. It's not just the labor issue. The first is gain efficiency. So there are traditionally countries, regions who have expertise on crops, producing the crop and the seeds. They have the right infrastructure, the right equipment, and the traditional knowledge. So we need to leverage this knowledge very much. Also, and I think many people don't think about it, but the biology of the crop. So sometimes the seed production, the producing seeds efficiently, needs a different day length, different temperature than the crop itself. So the country is not capable of producing certain crops of seeds because the climate is not really adapted for it. So the second after efficiency is the seed supply, the security of the seed supply. And I think I already mentioned about that. It's the mitigating, especially the climate problem, the weather problems, which we know it's getting more extreme. So I think this type of risk mitigation will be absolutely needed in the future as well. And seed stability and seed supply stability is it's absolutely connected to increased food security. So partially because you diversify your seed production. So you can be sure that in the end you can provide farmers for the seeds, but also with this global seed supply you can offer a wide variation of different type of seed, which are mostly locally updated varieties which farmers can choose from. And potentially the last but not least is the to have in this way this kind of cooperation, because it's many occasions it's based on cooperation on an international company with the local company, so it's a very intensive knowledge transfer. So this is how you can teach and educate people in different countries in some best practices which has already come on in other countries. So I think it's a very important element to have this kind of very lively cooperation between private and public companies, and make sure that this knowledge will be transferred to other regions as well. So it's a very complex issue, and it's more than just a labor cost.
Sure, and this seems like a very good list to make sure that the global seed supply chain stays in place, but I think there are some challenges as well, right?
Yeah. Of course there are challenges, so it's our different, I think we are living in an international atmosphere, so we know about problems of time zones and languages, and so there are all kinds of barriers, but I think with this, especially with these new technological tools, I think it's easy to overcome. For me, the biggest challenge is absolutely the regulatory challenge. So we know that when a seed produced, it's not really known the final destination. So there are certain type of phytosanitary regulation to needs to fulfill. There are quality requirements. So, and it's not always consistent in every country. So I think what we need to maintain this global supply chain is the consistent regulation for all kind of areas. And as I said, in many areas we have international frameworks and standards, but there are others areas where we are lacking, or others where we have, but it's not consistently implemented in different countries. So for me, it's absolutely the compliance of national regulation, and sometimes distortion in the regulation is the biggest hurdle for this global supply chain.
Absolutely, thanks Xabi, and I'm sure ISF will be working very hard to overcome those challenges. Great. I've been hearing a lot about the past year, looking back at 2020, and here's a question that came in from the chat, which is directed to May. May, what are the expected problems in the seed supply chain that we can foresee for the remainder of 2021 and perhaps also beyond?
Yeah, well, we still see that, of course, the international seed movement is still a major challenge in our region. However, we see that at least the domestic market, the companies can still doing quite well on that. I do not think that overall picture of the global seed movement would be having again a big impact as compared to the last year in that, because the government start to learn, and some countries also start to facilitate the work for the private sector in terms of the laboratory testing, phytosanitary certificates. However, we still see that as right now is quite uncertain in some countries, especially in Asia Pacific region. Of course, we see the situation right now with the vaccine, and that the way we mitigate the risk also for the seed industry. However, we hope that, of course, the labor shortage still foresee, but hope that it would not be worse as we found in the last year. And so, yeah, that would be the trend that we foresee until the end of this year, Marcel.
Thanks, May. That's great. Shaba, I'd like to come back to you. We've been talking a lot about the challenges that the pandemic has posed on the agri-food chains and ways how to overcome them. In your recent study that you mentioned at the beginning, what were some of the key lessons towards resilience of the agri-food chain?
Thank you, Marcel, for the question. Yes, the agri-food chain, of course, they were affected by the COVID-19, similar to the seed sector. But there are different aspects of this, how it affected the food supply chain. The first one is the angle of food nutrition, so food security aspect. That was a challenge, but it was very important to keep the global food supply chain open and accessible so that the food can arrive to the consumers in time. So that was a great challenge, similar to the seed sector as well. And that's why agriculture sector was regarded as essential sector in most of the countries. It was very important to maintain the transparency of the food supply chain, even I would say more important than in the seed sector, because we were talking about providing food for people, so policymakers were very sensitive about this availability of this information and also the transparency of the food market. It was also important to find cooperative solutions between different countries, because some of the countries, they restricted export of food. So other countries were in the trouble if they needed food, imported food for the supplying their citizens with enough food. The policy answers were like speeding up the policy border control and to ensure the smooth cross-border trade between the countries. And as I said, to declare that agriculture is an essential sector, so the production could ongo in this way. The second part was the livelihood for farmers, because the restrictions affected how the farmers could not sell some of the products, food products, because there was a decrease in demand for food service suppliers, so like restaurants, they were closed down. So many of there was a surplus of food on the market, and perishable products had to be destroyed. Also, it was some cases when like meat factories were closed down, so animals they needed to killed, or it was an euthanasia kind of thing. So that was not really a good solution. So to be able to support the food producers, the government took different measures. For example, flexibility on granting or increasing, extending deadlines for applying the subsidies, for example. So the financial aspect was very important to support the companies and food producers to get enough money to maintain the basic food producing capacities. So then once the COVID-19 pandemic finished, they will be able to produce the same amount of food. So it was like a short-term measure, not to jeopardizing the long-term goal of the policies. So that was really the key issues. So it was very similar, but I would say it was even more sensitive for the governments to solve, or to ensure the seed supplies remain intact.
Thanks, Shaba. Very important recommendations there. Arthur, I'd like to come back to you and talk a little bit more about the harmonization of rules. Shabi already mentioned that a little bit, and sometimes I compare it with soccer. We are in the soccer period right now with the UEFA Euro 2020 tournament and Copa America, and it only works because everybody plays by the same rules. So the same rules towards the soccer game, but also in the seed trade that would apply. How will the harmonization of rules and regulations and policies across countries help towards a smoother movement of seeds in your Asia-Pacific region?
Yeah, thank you, Marcel. Yeah, I believe that harmonization is the way forward with alignment of policies between countries that are having international trade in terms of seeds, because this is very much needed so that the seed gets supplied on time and there's a smooth flow of material, seed material. If the seed material keeps getting blocked on the way, it might miss a season, or you might have so many challenges which sometimes can be sorted by harmonization of law and alignment of policies with the countries that we are in business with or in trade with. Because let's not forget that on one side there's a farmer who's producing the seed to be used by a farmer on the other side of the world. And then if there are no enabling policies, it really becomes difficult to do business, commerce, because sometimes I feel if 2 countries or 3 countries that are operating can sit together and come up with policies that are conducive, it's very important. And that's where harmonization is important. And those countries that still need to understand how things work at a global level can sit with the fellow countries, look at the production, look at your pest risk analysis, phyto requirements, and then bring in a smoother system. And I believe the APSA is doing a lot of work to bring this sort of harmonization, and it's very much required, because in this day and age, on one side you have people who are producing food, and on the other side you have a policy that's not helping the movement of seeds, so that's contradictory. So I feel over a period of time, if the harmonization can happen in our region and between regions that we work with outside of our Asia-Pacific and South Asia region, I think it's needed intra and inter-country, so that it really then puts everything together. So I believe harmonization is the way forward, and governments and policy makers should really consider it seriously and apply themselves and ensure that there is a ease of doing business, and that our license to operate is smoother than it is sometimes because of these challenges. Excuse me.
Thanks, Arthur. I heard you say harmonization is the way forward. I think that could be our new motto for the various national and regional seed association. I fully agree. We have a few minutes left, and we have another question coming in here in the live chat. May, do you have any recommendations for a smooth global and regional seed trade?
Yes, thank you very much, Marcel. This is very important question, and I think that this needs a long-term focus, from the regional perspective and from international. So from the international level, I believe that, of course, harmonization is still required. However, I would just focus more on the Asia-Pacific region, taking example of APSA, the way that we start to collaborate with our stakeholders to work with NPDO in each country this year. So what are we planning is very long-term process, because we start to be aware of this, regulation and also harmonization of the phytosanitary regulation. So this year we start to again do the questionnaires to start checking the current capacity of each country, because in Asia Pacific there are quite different in terms of the practices from one country to another country. So how can we bring or lift or help to build capacity of the countries that they still now do not have the same level of the policy measures or measurements compared to another country. So that's how we are focusing. So the plan is that we will work again, we continue our work with NPPO, and we link with International Seed Federation, with APSA, with CropLife Asia, with also APARI to work on this with our NPPOs, and we also link with Asia Pacific Plant Protection Organization, because this takes long-term plan, not just only 1 or 2 years to complete. So our focus is still on the pest risk analysis. How can we harmonize that? And that, of course, we get a support from the ISF after they publish the regulated pest list, and we can have NPO learning from that. And besides, we also need to work on how can we facilitate the capacity of the seed health laboratory of the countries in Asia Pacific, and this is very important. And also, we would like to request that the countries should not put restrictive methods to the specific disease, because it's very hard for seed company to set their plan or adjust their work accordingly, because they may lose 1 year, 1 season, and that would also a factor to delay seeds to deliver to the farmers. And there's so many good initiatives that we have worked together with our stakeholders. I think that we are going to keep reporting on the development also to our, of course, our newsletter, and also all the channels of our seed association. Thank you. And if you have more questions, of course, I'm happy to answer after this session is done also. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, May. Very important. We are almost at the time, so Shabi, I'm going to give the last question to you, and you have 30 seconds for it. Great progress being made, but we're not there yet. Can you expand a little bit on the challenges that still remain for the international seed trade?
Yeah, I think when we got this kind of the survey from APSA, and we are doing our questionnaire, I think what was very interesting and a little bit funny that basically those areas where already we have challenges have been amplified by the COVID, where we had to solve anyway. So this is phytosanitary, export-import permits, non-tariff barriers and measures from certain countries. So basically nothing is new, just with the COVID it has been amplified and it was a higher magnitude. So I think together our partners, as May said, we have to work together to basically combat those challenges which has been a little bit now stressed us and confronted us in a higher level, but we are basically dealing with these same issues in our day-to-day business.
Mm-hmm. Thanks so much, Shabi. Looking at the time, I'm afraid that's all that we have for today. A big thanks to our panelists of today, Shaba, May, Arthur, Leanne, and Shabi here in the studio. And of course, a big thanks to our audience for listening and for your active participation in the live chat. I hope you found it interesting and valuable, and do enjoy the rest of the ISF Congress.